I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's November 22nd, and we have a lot to talk about. We're 2 days away from Thanksgiving in the United States, and I want to make sure you know how thankful I am for each of you for listening to Real Talk MS and for sharing your questions, your feedback, and your suggestions for future episodes with me. I'm thankful for all the scientists and clinicians who have found time in their already busy schedules to talk with me each week and share their work with us. And I'm thankful for all my friends at the National MS Society who make doing this podcast so easy for me. I hope each of you gets the Thanksgiving and the holiday season that you're hoping for. Spasticity is one of the more common symptoms of MS. It can feel like mild muscle tightness or stiffness, or it can be so severe that it produces painful, uncontrollable muscle spasms, usually in your legs. Spasticity can cause pain or tightness in and around your joints. It can even cause lower back pain. And left untreated, spasticity can lead to serious complications. Dr. Michelle Cameron is with us today to discuss what spasticity is and how to best manage it. Dr. Cameron is a neurologist and physical therapist, a professor in the Department of Neurology at Oregon Health and Science University, interim chief of neurology at the VA Portland Healthcare System, and co-director of the VA MS Center of Excellence West. But before we get to my conversation with Dr. Cameron, there are a few other things that you should know about. One of the curious things about multiple sclerosis is how, on the one hand, we readily acknowledge that MS affects everyone differently, and on the other hand, how people living with MS are grouped together, classified as having relapsing remitting MS or secondary progressive MS or primary progressive MS. MS presents as a pretty individualized experience. The disease course can be shaped by your age, your biological sex, your genes, race and ethnicity, other coexisting health conditions you may have, how long you've had MS itself, along with social and environmental exposures. That's a pretty significant list of variables that affect everyone differently. Many people living with MS have experienced being on a disease-modifying therapy that didn't seem to work for them. That's why the concept of personalized medicine, getting the right treatment at the right time for you, continues to gain traction and makes so much sense in the MS community. And it feels as though we've made a major step in the direction of personalizing MS treatments this past week, when an international panel of MS experts proposed a new framework for defining how different types of multiple sclerosis are described. The goal of this new way of talking about and thinking about MS is to move away from the separate clinical phases that we're all familiar with, relapsing remitting, secondary progressive, or primary progressive, and instead looking at MS as a continuous disease process that's driven by nervous system injury, counterbalanced by how well an individual's body can repair or compensate for that injury. In other words, having a biological understanding of what drives an individual's disease course will lead to better, more personalized treatments that are designed to stop MS in its tracks. So how might this new framework for considering and treating MS look like? Well, instead of basing a treatment plan on how well someone performs that 25-foot walk in their neurologist's office, that neurologist would have tools at hand that could detect and measure the underlying mechanisms of MS. Things like inflammation, myelin loss, nerve fiber loss, and whether your brain cells have sufficient energy to remain healthy. And based upon that data, a biologically based treatment plan would be developed, a treatment plan that would address those specific underlying mechanisms that are driving your MS. At the beginning of this segment, I characterized this new framework as a major step forward toward personalizing MS treatment. And as I talk about it, I think it feels more like a quantum leap forward. Now, these aren't the kinds of changes that can occur overnight. There's no button labeled paradigm shift that we can push. This vision will take years to realize. But this is important work that holds the promise of better MS treatments for everyone, and treatments that aren't about symptom management, but are aimed squarely at stopping MS in its tracks. You can be sure that we'll continue to talk about and report on this significant step forward in how neurologists might more precisely evaluate and treat multiple sclerosis. And if you'd like to review the details of this paper, you'll find a link in today's show notes. Because MS carries with it such a long list of potential symptoms, being prescribed different symptom management medications isn't at all unusual. Perhaps it's baclofen for spasticity, one of many antidepressants to manage depression, Klonopin to quiet a tremor, maybe something for pain. And then there are the other medications you might be taking for things like digestive issues or other health conditions. And of course, we can't forget your disease-modifying therapy. That all adds up to a lot of different medications. Polypharmacy is a term that's defined as taking 5 or more medications at the same time. Polypharmacy has been shown to increase the risk of an individual requiring hospitalization or a trip to the emergency room. In fact, the World Health Organization has identified polypharmacy as a growing public health concern. There hasn't been a lot of research focused on polypharmacy and MS, so a research team at the University of British Columbia analyzed pharmacy data from 14,227 people living with MS in British Columbia, Canada, during the year 2017. The team discovered that almost 4,000 of these individuals were regularly taking 5 or more medications. And they further determined that women who were older, and those people with additional health conditions, as well as people living in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, were most likely to be the ones taking 5 or more medications. The team found that more than half of the individuals taking 5 or more medications were in fact taking 8 or more medications at any one time. Looking at the rate of hospitalizations among these 14,227 people living with MS, the team found that people with MS taking 5 or more medications had twice the risk of being hospitalized in 2017 compared with the people with MS taking fewer than 5 medications. Now, I don't think this study should lead anyone to stop taking their medication. Just like when you start a medication, stopping a medication should be a shared decision that's made with your prescribing physician. This study should serve as a reminder of the importance of making sure all the members of your MS care team know about all the medications, prescription, over-the-counter, even supplements, all of the medications that you're taking. In this case, over-communication is a very good thing. And if you'd like to review this study, I'm going to suggest you visit friend of the podcast Sharon Roman's blog titled Tremlet's MS Research Explained, where you can read a plain English report of this study. And for those of you who want to dive a little deeper, I'll include a link to Sharon's blog as well as the published study itself in today's show notes. Research that was reported at the beginning of this year provided compelling evidence that the Epstein-Barr virus, or EBV, triggers MS. And if you're a newer listener and you missed that news, you can get up to speed by checking out episodes 229 and 231 of Real Talk MS, and I'll include those links in today's show notes. A research team from Harvard determined that individuals who might be susceptible to MS, these are people whose genetic background, environment, or lifestyle increases their risk of MS, well, these individuals were 32 times more likely to develop MS once they'd been exposed to the Epstein-Barr virus. And experts have shared with me that eliminating the Epstein-Barr virus could eliminate most of the MS in the world. EBV is a very common virus, infecting about 90 to 95% of the U.S. population. It works by infecting a person's B cells, the immune cells that produce antibodies in our system. This is the virus that causes mononucleosis. But the majority of people who are infected by the Epstein-Barr virus never develop mono. This is a virus that stays in your body for your entire lifetime, and there's no treatment that can eliminate the Epstein-Barr virus from a person's system. All of this information places an Epstein-Barr vaccine very high on the list of ways to end MS forever. And this past week, a research team from the National Institutes of Health and Walter Reed Army Institute of Research published their work identifying 6 human antibodies that were shown to prevent EBV infection in B cells. These antibodies were mapped to portions of specific proteins where they were able to have the strongest effect, identifying parts of the virus that might be particularly vulnerable to these antibodies. Now, although this work is in its very early stages, it's nonetheless very encouraging, and the NIH has announced that additional research is planned to further explore how these antibodies might be harnessed and used as future therapies. If you'd like to review the details of this research, you'll find a link in today's show notes. This is a week dedicated to giving thanks, and one more thing that I'm very thankful for are my friends at MS, the participant-powered MS research network, for inviting me in and allowing me to work on some very special projects focused on MS caregivers. One of those projects involves developing a toolkit for MS caregivers. And if you're a caregiver or you know an MS caregiver, it would mean a lot to me if you'd spend about 5 minutes completing a short online survey. Getting your opinion will help ensure that our toolkit offers the right resources to help resolve the issues that are most important to MS caregivers. The survey is completely anonymous, and rather than rattle off a long, complicated URL, I've created a shortcut that I hope you'll find easy to remember. Just visit realtalkms.com/caregiver, and you should find yourself at the survey. Now, the URL is mine, but the survey isn't. It's being administered by MS, and again, it's completely anonymous. We know all the ways that MS can impact an individual, but what we don't often talk about is the impact that MS has on their caregiver. The National MS Society reports that 64% of MS caregivers report feeling emotionally drained, 32% experience depression, and 22% have lost a job due to their caregiving responsibilities. Additional research has shown that long-term family caregivers face a more limited lifetime earning potential, along with a shortened life expectancy. November is National Caregivers Month. It's a month that reminds us of the importance of caring for the caregiver. By sharing your opinion through our online survey, you can play a role in improving the life of someone who's dedicated to improving the life of someone else who's living with MS. I want to thank you in advance for investing 5 minutes of your time in helping to create an MS caregiver toolkit that we hope will provide the right answers to the right caregiving questions before those questions even arise. Again, you'll find the survey at realtalkms.com/caregiver, and I'll be sure to include that link in today's show notes. And since we're in the midst of National Caregivers Month, it seems like the right time to review the national strategy to support caregivers. You may remember that the RAISE Family Caregivers Act was signed into law in January of 2018. Now, RAISE is an acronym for Recognize, Assist, Include, Support, and Engage Family Caregivers. And among other provisions, that law directed the Secretary of Health and Human Services to develop a national family caregiving strategy. On September 22, 2021, the RAISE Family Caregiving Advisory Council released its initial report to Congress. This report outlined the significant challenges faced by family caregivers. It made note of the federal programs that were currently available to support caregivers, and the report provided 26 recommendations for better supporting family caregivers. These recommendations were used to form the foundation of the National Family Caregiving Strategy. And on September 21st, 2022, the 2022 National Family Caregiving Strategy was delivered to Congress. The strategy includes nearly 350 specific actions the federal government will take over the next 3 years to support family caregivers, and more than 150 recommended actions that can be adopted by the state and local levels of government and across the private sector to begin to build a system designed to provide family caregivers the resources they need to maintain their own health, well-being, and financial security while they provide support for others. This strategy proposes 5 main goals. These goals include increasing awareness and outreach, building partnerships and engagement with family caregivers, strengthening services and support, ensuring financial and workplace security, and expanding data, research, and evidence-based practices. There are more than 53 million family caregivers in America, and this strategy represents the very first national approach to recognizing and supporting them. You can be sure that we'll continue following this work, and if you'd like to review the 2022 National Family Caregiving Strategy, you'll find a link in today's show notes. I started Real Talk MS because I found myself inspired by the amazing MS research that I saw taking place in laboratories all around the world. But I have to say that meeting so many members of the MS movement, from scientists to clinicians to fundraisers, caregivers, and of course people who are living with MS, well, I've come to realize that nothing is more inspiring than the human spirit. And this week's inspiration comes from Spanish marathon runner Eric Domingo Roldan and his mom, Sylvia, who was diagnosed with MS when Eric was 7 years old. About 6 years ago, Eric began running marathons, races of 23 miles or 38 kilometers. And in an effort to raise awareness of MS, he ran those marathons while pushing his mother in her wheelchair. And a year ago, Eric and his mother entered the Guinness Book of World Records, setting a world record for fastest marathon pushing a wheelchair with a time of 2 hours, 53 minutes, and 28 seconds. In the years since their record-setting run, Eric and his mom Sylvia have continued running marathons, raising awareness, raising money, and reminding people that so many of the obstacles that we face in life are simply the ones we've placed in our own way. If you'd like to follow Eric and Sylvia, you'll find Eric's Instagram handle in today's show notes. There are some MS symptoms that create real obstacles to engaging in life. Spasticity can feel like mild muscle tightness that you wish would just go away, or it can be so painful and debilitating that it keeps you from moving. Dr. Michelle Cameron is joining us today to tell us everything we need to know about spasticity, including how to best manage it. In a moment, we'll meet my guest, Dr. Michelle Cameron. Spasticity is a common symptom of MS that can be experienced as a mild feeling of muscle tightening or a painful, uncontrollable spasm in your legs. Spasticity can also produce feelings of pain or tightness around joints, and it can even cause lower back pain. Returning to the podcast this time to talk about what spasticity is and how to best manage it is Dr. Michelle Cameron. Dr. Cameron is a neurologist and physical therapist, a professor in the Department of Neurology at Oregon Health and Science University, interim chief of neurology at the VA Portland Healthcare System, and co-director of the VA MS Center of Excellence West. Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Cameron.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So let's start at the very beginning. What exactly is spasticity, and how common is it among people living with MS?
So actually, John, you described it very well in your introduction. Spasticity is really a tightness or a stiffness of the muscles, usually of the legs, sometimes also of the arms. This comes with painful contractions, spasms, involuntary movements of the muscles, either bending or straightening when you didn't plan it without control. And about 80% of people may experience some degree of spasticity, although its severity does vary from person to person.
What causes spasticity? And I think you've started to answer this part of my question already, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how spasticity can actually affect someone.
So spasticity is caused by the damage MS does to the brain and spinal cord. The muscles should contract normally, and then we inhibit that activity with actions from the brain and spinal cord. When the brain and spinal cord are damaged, muscle movements can go uncontrolled and be excessive. And the impacts this can have are pretty broad. So the muscles can contract when you don't want them to. So this could be in the day. Here you are trying to walk along and your muscles are going in directions you didn't intend them to. That doesn't work so well when you're trying to walk or feed yourself. You could have the muscles start moving when you're asleep. That can wake you from sleep and can wake your bed partner from sleep if you kick them. So it can make you tired. So really affecting all the things we do with our arms and legs. And if you don't get to pick when they move, that can have pretty broad impacts.
What happens if spasticity is left untreated?
So that's an important thing to understand. Mild spasticity often is left untreated and is completely fine. So if you have a little bit of stiffness in your muscles, whether you treat it or not really depends on your desire to do more things, whether it's more exercise or take more medications, or to really work around that spasticity. But as the spasticity gets worse, or if it gets worse and starts to affect your quality of life, causes falls, causes sleep disturbance, then it's really important to treat it to make your life better. And then if severe spasticity is left untreated for a longer period of time, the muscles can actually get tight and be difficult to move the joints, and that causes what we call contractions. The joints actually get stuck in position.
Are there things that people living with MS can do that might lessen the likelihood that they'll experience spasticity?
Sure. So I think there's two pieces to what you can do to lessen the likelihood of experiencing spasticity. One of them is sort of the long-term plan, which is, if appropriate, taking the disease-modifying therapy your provider has recommended and that you've selected together. Those disease-modifying therapies should lessen the likelihood of you experiencing all of the complications of MS, and spasticity is one of them. And then there's the short-term solution. Oh, you have some spasticity. What can you do to stop it being worse in the moment? And things that tend to trigger spasticity, fast movements is the most known. Extremes of heat and cold. Anything that tends to flare up your other symptoms. So an infection, urinary tract infection is the most common. Fatigue, stress, pain, even tight clothing can sometimes make spasticity worse.
When we feel muscle tightness, our first instinct might be to stretch it out. But not all forms of stretching are good for relieving spasticity. What can you tell us about stretching as a means of managing spasticity?
So as I just mentioned, rapid movement actually can make spasticity worse. It can make the muscles tighten even more. So the first important thing about stretching is you don't want to do very fast stretching. You don't want to move the muscles very quickly as you stretch. You should really do slow stretching. And slow stretching has been the first line of management for many, many years for controlling spasticity, is to stretch those muscles out to stop them tightening. And this certainly sounds like a reasonable thing to do. And many patients report that this is helpful. Being a scientist, I tend to go to the research. And what does the research say? The research is pretty inconclusive. We don't truly know from research if stretching helps with spasticity. So what I recommend is that you do your own experiment of try stretching, do it consistently, do it daily for a while, and see if it helps you. But do that stretching, do slow stretching.
Are there other exercises or physical activities that can help manage spasticity?
So there are a lot of other things that can really help manage spasticity or its side effects, the pain, the imbalance, weakness. This, as I was always taught, motion is the lotion. Keeping things moving keeps things moving. So often stationary bicycling may be helpful, that rhythmic movement, yoga with slow stretches, aquatherapy, exercise in water can be helpful. Really looking for what works for you. It may be that a physical therapist needs to guide you as to what exercises to do.
What about medications? Which medications are typically used in managing spasticity?
So there's a pretty wide range of medicines. Generally, we start with pills, oral medications, and usually the first kind that people try is baclofen. Take it usually starting in the evening and maybe a couple of times a day. If that doesn't work or you need to take more and more of it, and more you take, the more likely you are to have side effects. And the side effect is usually drowsiness. So start with baclofen. If we can't get to a dose that works well for you without making you too drowsy, we may add in tizanidine. This is also can make people sleepy, but sometimes you can find a sweet spot between the two. And then if those two together don't work, we sometimes add something from the benzodiazepine group. That's a Valium kind of medication or a clonazepam. We're pretty leery or cautious using those medicines. You don't want to take too much of them. They again can make people sleepy. You may end up needing more and more. So that's sort of the menu of oral medicines. Sometimes when these oral medications aren't effective enough, we use injections. So injections of botulinum toxin into muscles that have spasticity. This can only be done in a limited number of muscles, so it's not your whole body, but it can be really helpful if a specific muscle is particularly problematic. And then very occasionally, we actually take that baclofen, and instead of taking pills, surgeons put in a pump where there's baclofen that then goes to your spinal cord. And given this is where the spasticity is coming from, you actually need a lot less baclofen to do this, which sounds, in principle, is a great idea. Put the medicine where it needs to go. Unfortunately, it's a little tricky to do that. Obviously, you need surgery to put the pump in. You need to refill that pump so that you have to come back to have that happen. And the pump pumps through little hoses to get to your spinal cord, and those can get clogged or infected. So it's quite some work to maintain a baclofen pump, and they can be challenging. So it's certainly not the first place we go. So kind of a wide range from these pills to injections to a pump, depending on the severity of the spasticity, its location, and how well it's responding to trials of these different things. That was a long answer, but it's a complicated story.
And part of that answer, I heard you mention botulinum toxin injections. So I'm curious, is this the same stuff that people use on their faces to reduce wrinkles? And if it is, how does that work when it comes to managing spasticity?
So it is the same stuff. So good catch. Although usually a lot less in the face than in the legs. The muscles are much smaller. But it basically works the same way for both things. It weakens the muscles. So if you don't want wrinkles in your face, what makes wrinkles is contracting your muscles so it shortens them and crinkles up the skin on your face. And that's what a wrinkle is. That's what it looks like. So if we weaken those muscles so they can't contract, you don't look like you have wrinkles. The same thing for spasticity. If we inject the muscles in your legs that are contracting when you don't want them to, they won't contract. And that's how it controls spasticity.
You mentioned that heat and cold can both trigger spasticity, but temperature therapy can also be a beneficial treatment. Can you explain how temperature therapy works?
Yes and no. I'll do my best. It's a little tricky because we don't really know. So extremes of heat and cold, heat can trigger spasticity just because it tends to worsen everything with MS. It makes the nerves not conduct as well. And cold, as the shock, can make the muscles tighten up. But when we use cold for a long time, it actually somewhat paralyzes the muscles or stops them contracting. So it can briefly, for a half an hour, make the muscles weaker and thus control the spasticity. This can give us a little gap or an opportunity to stretch them. So they might use long cold in physical therapy. And then heat, at a mild level of heat, can be relaxing and thus ease muscle spasms.
Besides physical activity and medication, there are assistive devices, splints, and braces that can help manage spasticity. Can you talk about some of these tools?
Sure. So exactly. It sort of tends to be this sort of three-pronged approach. Some medications, some exercises, and then, as we said earlier, some sort of workarounds. And those workarounds are braces or splints or support devices, walking aids. So braces may try to support a movement that's being impacted by spasticity. I think the easiest one, as an example, is at the ankle. So people with spasticity and with MS, often when they walk, their toes drag and they catch on their toes when they're trying to bring their foot forwards. This is usually from a combination of weakness of the muscles that bring the toes up and spasticity of the muscles that bring the toes down. So the toes get stuck down. If you put a brace behind the leg and under the foot, that actually helps prop the toes up so you don't trip on them. And that's called an ankle foot orthosis or an AFO. That's an ankle brace. That can be helpful. There can be electrical systems, functional electrical stimulation that essentially do the same thing and try to stimulate the muscles that bring the toes up. And then walking aids, canes, crutches, walkers. If you're being thrown off balance by your spasticity and therefore having trouble with safe mobility, a walking aid can help. That muscle goes the wrong way, it can catch you and help put you moving in the right direction. So all of these can help you work around your spasticity and keep you moving and doing the things you want to.
And how can working with a physical therapist help someone manage their spasticity?
So a physical therapist can do a few different things. They can, first of all, assess if you have spasticity. How bad is it? Is that the only thing contributing to your troubles with mobility or your pain, your weakness? Is it all spasticity or is there something else going on? Do you have weakness that needs strengthening? Do you have trouble putting muscles in the right places? So could be a variety of contributors to the functional challenge you're having. And they can then help design the ideal program that's a combination of stretches, other exercises, safety changes, maybe using devices to really get your life back on track.
Well, Dr. Michelle Cameron, thank you for all you do to improve the quality of life for people living with MS. And thanks for talking with me today.
Thank you, John. Thanks for the opportunity.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/273. You'll find that link in today's show notes so you can easily copy and paste it right into your email or text. Once again, I want to wish each of you a healthy and a very happy Thanksgiving. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.